Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It seems a bit strange because I'm talking into my PowerPoint slides and not with you in a room, but I'm delighted to be here at this virtual crisis communications conference. And I'd like to take a moment to thank Katie and the team at Grapevine for Communications for inviting me to share my passion with you today in speaking about effective risk and crisis comms, the science behind the message. Is everyone seeing the screen okay? Are there any challenges with that so far? We're good to go? Okay.
Shawna, sorry, I don't actually see your presentation. Like, we can see you.
Are you sharing your screen, Shawna?
Okay, just a minute. I don't think I am. And I think, so clearly I'm in communications, but I'm not a technical person. So give me 1 second here. Okay, see the PowerPoint, see the screens. And I just want to make sure that you can see my slides. And I need to go down to share screen. Okay, I'm hitting that and I'm pulling this up. So thank you. I think I forgot to do a step there. This is why I work with a guy when I do media training that does all this technical stuff, because I'm always paranoid that I won't get it right. How's that?
Yeah.
Perfect.
How are we doing there? Is that better? Can you see the screen?
Perfect.
Okay, so thank you so much for allowing me to be here today to talk with you about risk and crisis comms. It's a real passion of mine, and I get a little bit excited, and I try not to talk too quickly, and I probably pack way more into the time allotted than I'm supposed to, but I always feel I get this captive audience for such a short amount of time, and I just want to leave them with something that they can take away and apply right away. So that's how we're going to walk through this here today. And my whole goal is to really cover a little bit about COVID-19, because I mean, how can we not? I mean, it's everywhere, and talk about why this COVID-19 pandemic is different from other crisis events that we faced in the past, why and how we need to talk about risk, so communicating risk, and a little bit about the psychological barriers to communication with crisis comms and how to overcome them. I want to give you some points to ponder in that area. And along the way, we're going to break down some images and some case studies to see what went well, what works, and just some good examples of how to maybe manage risk and crisis comms more effectively within your organizations. So I'm just going to do that. Okay. So I don't feel we could start any presentation about risk and crisis comms in this time frame without speaking about COVID-19 and why this pandemic is so different. And I believe this pandemic is really different from anything, at least I've ever seen in my lifetime. So if we go back in history, because we always talk about history repeating itself, the Spanish flu estimated that 30 to 50 million people died in total, and possibly double that number because we didn't have the ability to track and share the data as we do today. 2 to 3 million of those people died in the first wave. And it frightens me to think that we've really just experienced our first wave of the COVID-19 crisis, and that we're starting to enter the second wave now into the summer months, when we're seeing all of these large gatherings of people with the protests, etc. And people finally, especially if you live around here, you've been kind of in your house since October with the colder weather. So it's a bit of a frightening scenario for us. But I think a major difference today that as communicators we need to address and look at, and those that work in emergency management, is that we've had this ability to communicate and share information across the globe with social media, the internet, video conferencing. We have international webinars daily and think tanks that are meeting. And if you think about it, the World Health Organization wasn't even established until 1948. So back then there was no sharing of this resources for countries who were dealing with the Spanish flu that they believe was largely brought back into the countries by troops returning from the First World War. But today we're learning from one another, and we're developing and adopting our responses and our programs essentially based on the actions that other countries have taken that have worked, and we're learning what didn't work, and we're bringing it all together to try to manage this crisis. It's a very fluid crisis, right? And at the same time, we're trying to balance individual rights for the collective good with public health and safety. And this is an ever-changing equation, right? We're telling people to stay at home, social distance, all of this, and it's been challenging. But the main reason I think that this crisis is different was best said by the emergency management director out of Calgary, Tom Sampson, when he stated, we're dealing with a viral health pandemic, and we're also having a mental health crisis that's come out of this, and an economic catastrophe all at the same time. So this is really a disaster triad of sorts. And this is very true. When we have people working on all three prongs of this pandemic simultaneously, we're also communicating information specific to these three areas. So that's what's made it a little more challenging, I think, than a normal crisis where we kind of go in, we know what we have to do, we have our plan. And, in larger disasters, we see long-term disasters like the Fort McMurray and the Calgary floods. But we can have an emergency happen in a day or 2 days. But this was a long and slow moving emergency. Oh, no, I have to remind myself that I can't use that. So here we go. And then we start dealing with misinformation, right? On top of all this we've got going on, we start dealing with misinformation and the challenge of correcting that misinformation. We added in daily news conferences at the federal level, at the provincial level. Some municipal communities did the same thing to keep our audiences informed. And we still see daily changes to the information that we're sharing and presenting. So we just get the information out there and then we get an update or a change that we have to re-communicate. So we had this word come out of infodemic, and I do believe we're absolutely dealing with an infodemic, that excessive amount of information about this pandemic, and it just makes our jobs as communicators all the more challenging. So during this pandemic, I was invited to support NATE here in Edmonton in their emergency ops center as an assistant public information officer. And I found myself taking a media diet. I mean, we had so much information going on inside the organization that at night I was so exhausted, I could barely look at my social media feeds and keep up with what was going on and watch a news conference. So I became really selective and focused on those key, trusted, and credible sources, and I tuned out the rest of that information. So I think the infodemic has created a demand for information that as communicators, we've been struggling to sustain. And so science leaders in the field, they talk about this, and this is an important takeaway from Dr. Peter Sandman, who's a renowned risk communication expert. And he talks about, you can have like the best risk insights, you can have the best, scientists up there talking about it, you can have the leading experts in the field. However, if we don't have an effective risk communications program, we will fail to achieve our aim in supporting public health and safety. So in other words, we have to be as strategic with risk and crisis comms as we do with anything else. We need to be, as Katie would say, we need to be prepared. And so this is what I hope to cover in the short time together this morning, is some of the science-based, tried and true tactics that you can take away and apply within your own organizations right away to support ensuring you're delivering effective communications with your programs. But communicating risk can be challenging, not just because of infodemics and misinformation, but because we all have different perceptions of personal risk. That is based on our values and our experiences that shape our thinking and our perspectives on how much risk we're willing to take upon ourselves. So I'd like to do a little exercise, and I'm going to, so forgive me, I've never done this Zoom poll before. The girls are helping me with this, so please be patient. I'm going to share a slide with you with 4 questions, and then I'm going to ask you to vote on it. So I think I have to stop sharing. Oh, here we go. Look at that. They're so cool. So basically, I'm asking you to vote on the activity you believe personally presents the most risk to you. When you look at these 4 things, what is the riskiest behavior you see in there? Okay. Wow, you're all world travelers, because nobody's afraid of eating from a street market in Thailand, it looks like. But in this little poll, you've just been able to identify that risk. Oh, we've got a few there. There we go. Okay. But when you look at this, you're demonstrating to me that even as an audience, you can see just amongst ourselves how subjective risk can be. If you look, I did some training with the RCMP, and it was interesting because you have a room full of police officers. The number one risk to them was driving without a seatbelt, because from their perspective and vantage points, they've seen way too many accidents and horrific scenes and fatalities for those that don't wear a seatbelt. So that is the perspective they're bringing to the table when I ask this question. I'm seeing that not a lot of skiers there, and absolutely. And that's the thing, right? Some people ski double black diamond runs, some people ski green runs, like me, like her whole life. And I'll never get past that. So the reality is, we look at this, and some people don't fly on holidays. They restrict their holiday plans locally because they're afraid to go in an airplane. The point being, you don't know what level of risk perception your audience has, and that's what makes the communication so challenging. So did we share the results there? We're good with that? Oh, so that's not doing that. But so that was, so if you don't see that, skiing the double black diamond was number 1, driving without a seatbelt, number 2, and you were tied for the public speaking and eating at the street market in Thailand. So thanks for your participation with that. I appreciate that. And I know that I didn't, okay. I'm just going to the next slide, but there we go. So those were your questions. There we go. Froze up for a moment there. Here we are. So with risk, we're working to educate our stakeholders before a crisis so that they're prepared to respond to that crisis or in a crisis. And when we communicate risk, we want to ensure that our approach is open and transparent right from the beginning. If we start the conversation early and we start building up that cup of trust and credibility and support, then people will more likely listen to us in a crisis about the actions we want them to take. But they need to trust you before they will take those actions. So that's why being honest and open and transparent and sharing that information you have about the risk is so important. And the other thing is, you also want people to think about the actions you're asking them to take as second nature, right? So they're prepared to take the appropriate steps during that emergency. Think about the fire drills you practice as a child or at work today, the protocols even that we put in place for COVID-19 about washing your hands. These are the actions that we've been asked to take for our own safety to stop spread the virus. But I wanted to just give you a little story background about communicating risk and that importance of preparedness here. And this is a bit of a story time. The photo on the right here is ground zero. And I want to share with you a story about why communicating risk and practicing the actions are so very important. And this is through an excerpt from the book by Amanda Ripley. I'm going to hold it up here. It's called The Unthinkable: Who Survives when Disaster Strikes and Why. I have it as a reference at the back of this thing here. But I wanted to share a little story that I have to read out a little bit about Rick Riscorla. Now, Rick is was a retired decorated soldier who was the head of security for Morgan Stanley Dean Witter in the Trade Center. In 1990, he brought in another ex-military guy who was a specialist in counterterrorism to see his building because he wondered if an attack was possible on the building and if they were at risk. His friend agreed that all they needed to do was for a terrorist to drive a truck through the garage and the underground parking below and let a bomb go off. So they wrote a report to the Port Authority, who had responsibility for security of the towers, and outlined all of their concerns and the risks that they thought were prevalent. But due to cost and their request to add extra security in that parking garage, they were ignored. Risk sometimes it's like selling insurance, right? It costs a bit of money up front, but boy, does it save you in the end. 3 years later, a terrorist drove a truck full of explosives in the underground parkade of the World Trade Center, and the vibrations could be felt through the tower. After that day, with the approval of his leadership, Rick started running the entire company through secret surprise fire drills. He also instructed them to ignore any safety commands from the Port Authority during an emergency because he didn't trust them. Now, Morgan Stanley was an investment bank with a millionaire, high-performance bankers that resided and worked on the 73rd floor of that building. They didn't appreciate having their high-end meetings interrupted to walk down all those stairs for a fire drill, but Rick didn't care. See, he knew the best way to get the brain to perform under extreme stress was to repeatedly run rehearsals beforehand so that people became comfortable in the routine and so that they knew what they had to do. And he reported, he did little reminders about what to do in fire drills, not to wear your high heels, to have extra shoes, that you're leaving all your personal belongings behind so no one has the cumbersome challenge of carrying a briefcase or a purse down the stairs. So on the morning of 9/11, Rescorla heard an explosion and saw Tower 1 burning from his office window. And the Port Authority came on and urged everyone to stay at their desks. But Rescorla grabbed his bullhorn, his walkie-talkie, and his cell phone, and he systematically ordered the Morgan Stanley employees to get out. I want to say that these, most massive of them people, were in the 44th floor of this building. And the employees descended together as a massive group, 2 stairs at a time, because he had done the runs before and thought that doing 1 stair at a time wasn't going to get them out quickly enough for a fire and explosion. No purses, no personal belongings, just as they'd practiced. And because it was dark in the stairwells, he wanted them to take a hold of the person in front of them and carefully and quickly go down the stairs. They knew what they had to do. They had done the drills before. And as they were evacuating calmly down the stairs, when the second plane hit, he told them to stop, be still, be silent, be calm. Everything's going to be okay. He was the voice of calm during this amazing tragedy that happened. So Rescorla got those people out and successfully saved most of the Morgan Stanley employees that day. Sadly, he died a hero when he went back in to help others who were not leaving the building under the recommendation of the Port Authority. He and 4 of his security officers died inside, and he was last seen on the 10th floor, but he saved 2,687 people that day. The muscle memory allowed these people to perform their evacuation drill despite the horrors going on around them. So he likely had many grumbling and complaining during his fire drills because they thought, this is an inconvenience to me. I don't want to do this fire drill. I might go into cardiac arrest even walking down those stairs. But doing those drills saved people's lives. So during this COVID crisis, we saw a lot of risk messaging to wash your hands, scrub for 20 seconds with warm water and soap. And it was a very prescribed action. And we started to see signage and hear messages across several mediums. So this was the risk communication that we were seeing. So now I'd like to kind of lean into psychological barriers and talk to you about the communications that we see, the challenges to communications we see from these barriers. So risk and crisis comms are science-based, and there are several psychological barriers to communications and factors that impact that risk perception. And in a crisis, we find that people who are affected absorb the information presented and process information and act on that information differently than in daily routines. So by understanding how people want to receive that information and process it, this is what helps us in an emergency or a crisis better prepare our communications. So there are 4 things your audiences do in a crisis, and we're going to talk about each of them individually in the following slides. The first thing, though, that they like to do, just to give you an overview, is they simplify the message. They hold on to their current beliefs. They look to others for more info and opinions, and they believe the first message they read or hear. So what we're going to talk about is break these down a little bit to try to understand them better with some examples. So the first thing your audience does is simplify that message. So as simple as you're trying to make it for them, in their mind, when there's stress or increased anxiety over a crisis or risk situation, your audiences will miss important details in that safety messaging. They're not thinking clearly. They're not focused. So their brains are simply taking in that information and it's simplifying it. They are in denial that anything is truly impacting them. So that's the first barrier. A second barrier is that the second thing they do is they hold on to their current beliefs about the situation. And it can be difficult to change people's mind to take a different action against something they don't really believe in. You need your messages and your outreach written to encourage individuals' belief that they are empowered to act and give them a range of responses. So as an example, you might list your messaging as, you must do X. You should do Y, and you can do Z. So you must wash your hands. You could cough in your elbow, and you should stay at home. So it's the way that you stage that information for them that allows them to kind of take a level of action that is in sync with their current belief. It doesn't mean we can't increase their belief level to say, oh, I have to do all of these right away, but they like to be empowered to have a choice. I have to say, it's kind of funny not being able to really see all of you and have you nodding or not nodding or looking confused. So I feel like I'm kind of rambling on here but I'm hoping it's going okay at your end. The next thing that they do is that they always look for additional information and opinions. And they want to make sure that they were going to confirm your message before they act on it. They want to know what others think and that the actions that others are going to take, because there's kind of safety in numbers, right? So Dennis Maletti is a disaster researcher from Colorado, and once he said in a FEMA prep talk that in his 50 years of academic research, the one main takeaway that he got out of all that research was that in a real risk situation, the number one thing that people did when facing that risk of a hurricane or a flood was call their mothers. So if we can just get every mother on board with our safety messages, we should be good to go. So can you imagine your house is flooding, or your shed has just gone down the river, the hurricane winds are blowing outside, and you're saying, hey mom, it's me, Shawna, should I evacuate? You know, the water's rising. What do you think? We feel better about the decisions we make when we have others supporting our way of thinking. That's why we kind of have like-minded friends. And to be really inclusive, we need to invite people to the table that aren't like-minded. We don't like to be standing alone out there. And so that's another thing that people do. They look to others for opinions. So we need to make sure information that's out there is effective and solid and not a lot of misinformation, so that the other information they're gathering isn't coming from sources that are credible. So the other thing that happens, the fourth barrier, is that our audiences believe the first message that they hear. It often becomes the accepted message. And even though we don't even have normally all of that information available when we get that first message out there, people will compare that first message to anything you share afterwards. So think about the messaging that went across social media about stocking up on toilet paper. Even though we had trusted health professionals, credible people telling us that this health pandemic did not result in anything that would require us to use excess amounts of toilet paper, people still stocked up to the point that you couldn't buy any. And the reason behind this is interesting as well, because it's the psychology that goes back to our psychology and our creature comforts and our Maslow's hierarchy of needs in a way. Toilet paper is considered a comfort to us. We don't want to be without our comforts in a time of crisis. So just to be sure, we're stocking up. So to recap these barriers for you, the psychological barriers we're facing when we communicate in a crisis include our audiences simplifying those messages, holding on to their current beliefs that they had before we started communicating to them, looking to others for more information and opinions, and believing that first message that we shared. So really, what does this mean for us? What does this mean to us as communicators? Well, to help us break down these barriers and deliver effective messaging, there's 4 things we need to do. And we're going to take a closer look at these in the following slides. The first thing is using simple, consistent, and specific messages in risk and crisis communication. The second is supporting your messages with clear visuals, such as images, infographics, or videos. The third is ensuring your messages come from a trusted and credible source. And the fourth is a really important one. Release accurate messages and information as soon as possible so that people don't start filling the gap with their own opinions. So let's take a little look at those in more detail, breaking down those barriers. So if you consider that your risk communication strategy is a comms campaign, you need to be looking at your messaging going out in bite-sized chunks and making it digestible for people, keeping it at a grade 8 reading level, because remember what we said, that they are not able to dismantle and understand really complicated messages. We have to make sure that we know what audiences we're speaking to and make them specific. I thought that was a real thing in this COVID crisis is, you had information for small businesses, which is different for maybe information for teachers, or a little bit different for people that were working from home. So same underlying actions to be taken, but you're tweaking those messages for your individual audiences. And when you're dealing with emergency communications in a crisis that could impact public safety, life and death, you have to design your messages to motivate people, to provide protective information on how to protect themselves in that wherever you're conveying. And you have to write the messaging to be action taking. And we have to also remember that words matter. So using techniques such as visualizing communications, like visualization in your words that you choose to enhance that comprehension level, and actions that people will take as a result of hearing or reading your messages are really integrally important. So this is a message map, and one way to bridge together messages we know will save lives with actions that the public need to take to stay healthy and safe is to use message maps. And message maps are a really useful tool for risk and crisis communications. They were introduced by Dr. Vincent Cavello. He's a risk communication expert who does quite a bit of work with the World Health Organization, and many of you, like myself, may have actually taken some of his courses. So the idea is with a message map is it's allowing you to put together simple, specific, and your information stays consistent because you're sharing it across your organizations and with other agencies so that their message is the same as yours. So that's when you're talking, if you think about Alberta Public Health using a message map that goes down to all of the municipalities, health organizations, clinics, and doctors. This is a way to help keep messaging simple, specific, and consistent. Now, a message map, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the construct of one in a few slides, and I differ mine a little bit from Dr. Cavello that talks about 27 words and that. And I think now in this day and age, these message maps can also be used, not sound bites are getting longer on television. Video is the way of the future. Our social media posts are allowing us to even have more characters to tweet. So I keep it simple for my students at NAEP. And we'll talk about that formula in just another few slides. But looking at a message map is one tool in your toolbox that can work. And the thing about a message map is the goal with risk communication without this pandemic has really been to educate and inform our audiences, right? So that they take action to reduce the spread and help flatten the curve of COVID-19. Although I saw something the other day from Public Safety Canada talking about planking the curve, and I would kind of question them because I thought, well, what does that mean now? Why are we introducing a new catchy phrase? We don't want catchy. We want something that people that resonates with them, that will force them to take some action. So we told people to wash their hands. And so if you look at that message map, the 3 key messages here: wash your hands frequently, cough into your elbow, stay home, and stay healthy. And under each of those supporting messages, you'll see how we have this broken down on what each of those main key messages are. How you wash your hands frequently. So when I write these, I do my 3 main points across the top, and then I work down each pillar as key message 1, 2, and 3. So those are something, if you need an example of those, I have those on my website, or I'm posting those on my website. I can share those with you later. And this message map here reflects how you could break this down and keep the talking points available for your spokespeople or for those developing your social media campaigns, which I think is a great opportunity for them.
Shawna, can I just stop you for 1 second? We just had someone in the audience asking if you can make that larger. Probably the previous slide that I don't think that they were able to. Yeah. Are you able to make that any larger? Can you zoom in maybe?
I'm trying to zoom in now and seeing if I can. How's that?
There you go. Is that better?
I don't know is that okay, that one there? Did they?
Yep, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right. Now I'm not quite sure how to get out of that. Just give me a second here. There we go. Okay, and I will make sure that this is all going to be posted on my website later as well, so there'll be an example there for them as well. Okay, so when we talk about this, about risk and crisis communication, 95% of the work we do as communicators can be done before a crisis even hits us. So message maps, for example, can be prepared in advance for many of your possible scenarios. So when you think about what are the risks in your organization, and you can take them and do generic message maps, I almost call them muscle maps, message maps for each scenario. And then when you have the onset of a crisis or an emergency, they can just be tweaked with any specific details. Because when you think about it, you know, overland flooding, wildfire evacuations, active shooter events, most of the information that you're going to share with people will keep the core content the same. You might be tweaking where people need to go for an evacuation center, etc. But if you're doing any prep work on fire smarting homes or how to help, you know, prepare your home for a flood, a lot of municipalities and organizations are using them to try to get ahead of the curve to a degree. The message, you need to think of them kind of as your guide to help you develop your statements. They're a bit of the meat of your message sandwich. They're not the full message. They're not a holding statement complete. Obviously, they're written in just key messages, but they help drive the point home. And when you're in a crisis yourself, if I can say to you, it is a lot better working from a draft and editing that than trying to write one of these from scratch, okay? Take it for someone who's tried. And I think it was Sir Winston Churchill said this best when he said, "My apologies, I don't have time to write a shorter speech," because it takes time to cut down your words. And when I do this exercise in my workshops, you know, I'm telling people it's 3 key messages. Each message has 3 supporting points. Each entire pillar in that message is only 30 words. So there's a word count, and people struggle with that word count. And the whole message map should really have only no more than 90 words on it. And when I do this with students, if they exceed 90, I usually send it back to them and say, "I don't want to fail you because you can't count. Please redo this," because it's really important to keep the messages simple. And that's what the aim of this message map is, to give you your 3 key messages, but to keep the messages consistent and simple. Now, I want to talk a little bit about emergency communications as well, because a lot of communities and organizations are using public alerting systems or notification, you know, programs within that people sign up for. So you can upload holding statements that are legally approved in advance and be ready when a crisis strikes, giving very generic information. So when people say, "How fast do I need to reply or respond in an emergency?" Fine, between 15 and 30 minutes max. That's what you got to be prepared to do. And I think the best way to do that is to get some generic holding statements available that allow you to take accountability and say to your audience, "Yep, this event happened. This is us. We've got this. We're going to be getting more details to you as soon as they're available. Check back on this feed here often to see our updates and tell people where to go." But if you're using emergency communications when lives are in danger, you need to send those clear, specific messages that include these elements that are outlined by Dennis Milletti. You know, clear messaging, we know, saves lives. And so this is a good example here, and I'm going to show you a written one on the next slide. But you need to say who your source is. You know, tell them who you are. Who's the source of information? Remember, you're establishing your credibility and trust here. You need to share what the threat is, that location of that threat, what they need to do, and how much time they have to do it in. You know, give them the time, give them the guidance to take the action there. And then give an expiration time on your message so they know how long they have to get that action done. And don't forget to visualize your words. So when we talk about this in emergency communications, it's extremely important. And sometimes I see emergency messages that go out and we don't have the ability, or we don't have all of these factors sort of included in our messaging. Here's an example. You want to give enough information for people to make informed decisions. So this is an example Dennis Milletti used based on that previous slide. It's the Elm County Sheriff, that's who it is. Flood waters are approaching Wood City and will hit 2 blocks on both sides of Elm Creek. from Highway 110 to Maple Road. So he's not saying going north, going east, going west, because most people don't know where they live on a map. They're not quite sure what that means, but giving them specific visual reminders of those roadways is important. I love this. People outside will be washed downstream. Now there's a risk message. If you don't believe with this, if you don't do what you're told here, you may drown. The water will be above rooftops. That's a good visual. Not the water will be 10 feet high. The water could be 6 feet high. You know, move 2 blocks from the creek now and be there no later than 6 p.m. to avoid the flood. This message expires at 11 p.m. May 15th. So very specific messaging. I want to also talk a little bit about specific messaging is John Morales. He's a meteorologist in southern Florida, and he's been covering weather and hurricanes for over 30 years, and he's one of the longest serving weathermen in Florida. He also considers himself to be the scientist of the newsroom, and he was speaking on a call I was on last week that brought in reporters to talk about how they were going to address, talk about hurricane season in the U.S. It's the COVID crisis. So I just was kind of curious about that. And he shared that he started to write on the bottom of his messages or his news articles that went out, if you don't plan to evacuate, please do us a favor and take a Sharpie and write your social security number inside your arm, because this way it will help us identify you when you're dead from drowning in the storm surge or from being hurled around by a hurricane. Now that's pretty pointed advice, but he's been doing this for 30 years. People trust him. And I don't know how many people actually do the Sharpie thing, but I'm pretty confident people are evacuating when John tells them to. And that message is an interesting way to engage your audience to say how severe this weather system is coming in. We don't want you to drown in the storm surge. We don't want you to get whipped up by the hurricane. Get out of Dodge and evacuate when we tell you to. So this slide here is I found on LinkedIn, and it's from Round Rock, Texas. I'm gonna let you read that. And it remains my favorite COVID-19 risk comms example. It uses words to create a visual that really resonates with the audience in Texas in a fun but informative way. And humor can play a role in your risk or crisis communications. I would say more your risk communications because in a crisis, you're probably dealing with more emergency information, but you need to know your audience and you need to understand, you need to know them well enough backfire. So this was one that I think a great example of where people took the main message about washing hands, but just localized it a little bit with a bit of a Texas twang and appeal. Now this is an example here where messaging didn't go so well. This is not really risk communication, but an example maybe where they were a bit risky in their communication. So I thought I would include it because it's a good example. This is from the Calgary Police on Valentine's Day. It was their second year running this campaign without any previous complaints, but the public took issue with some of their comments. Some of them were offended by this, and they thought they shouldn't be really highlighting, joking about some of these people that had been incarcerated or that were in trouble with the law. So they handled it really well, though. They went out publicly with a letter. They said, we're going to take this off social media because some of you found it offensive, and we're going to review our protocols and to make sure that we don't kind of have this situation happen again. So they handled the crisis as well as they could, but it's just, I wanted to share an example about the humor. So this is an example here of risk communication, and a picture really is worth 1,000 words, right? The sign on the left is from a beach in Israel. I'm not sure what this says to you. I don't speak Hebrew, but maybe visitors would think there are great waves for surfing to be found here. But the critical error, in my opinion, is that it doesn't tell them what actions to take, and it's actually a tsunami warning sign. So the one on the right actually can be found along the coast of BC in tsunami warning zones, and it shows you to run away from the water and towards higher ground. The visuals are telling you what actions to take here. So cognitive psychology research shows us that images can strengthen communication in several different ways. They can capture attention, evoke emotions, and easily convey large amounts of information in a relatively short amount of time. Several recent studies highlight these processes and yield valuable insights for us as communicators. So I'm curious if on the left that sign is telling people, in case you see a tsunami coming, run to higher ground, whereas on the right, we're seeing it done with an image. So I wanted to also just share a little story about the tsunami warning signs, about the tsunami that happened in 2003 in the area around the Indian Ocean. So, or pardon me, 2004. So during the tsunami, Tilly Smith was she was a young girl at the time, she was 10 years old. She was credited with saving the lives of over 100 people that were beachgoers in Thailand by warning them minutes before the arrival of the tsunami caused by the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake. She was 10 years old and she learned about tsunamis in school. Specifically, 2 weeks before she arrived on holiday or Christmas with her family in a geography class. She recognized the signs of the receding water from the shoreline and frothing bubbles on the surface of the sea, and she told her parents, who warned others on the beach and the staff at the hotel in Phuket where they were staying. And the beach was evacuated before the tsunami reached the shore. And it was one of the very few beaches on the island with no reported casualties after that event. So her family denied, she was young, requests to speak to people in that, but they did bring her together to talk with Clinton, who was a UN Special Envoy for Tsunami Relief, at the first anniversary in Phuket as part of a campaign to highlight the importance of risk education. And so after the 2004 tsunami, Thailand created a tsunami evacuation system with alarm towers along the coast, plus radio, TV, and text message warnings, and clearly marked evacuation routes in densely populated areas. And they also now have similar signs posted in area beaches to help educate both the locals and the tourists. So risk education is so important. So I know you've seen these before. The signs on the left are a common standard in any high-rise building with an elevator. The one on the right was at a downtown Halifax hotel I stayed in last fall. And Halifax, as you know, brings in many tourists, lots of cruise ships. It brings people right up to Pier 21. And I was waiting at the elevator with a group of Japanese tourists that were not speaking English and looking at this sign. And I don't know what their response would have been in the unlikely event of a fire, because this brass plaque doesn't tell them what actions to take. I did, however, take my own actions and have a chat with the hotel manager about my concerns about risk communication and how that sign in this very, I would say, this area of the hotel that was attached to a shopping mall, very difficult to find the stairs and the exit to start with, that they needed to do a better job. So you've been probably seeing these signs your whole life, but I can guarantee, because of those visual communications and that risk education, you understand that none of you would ever, in the middle of a high-rise fire, take the elevator. And we know that human psychology plays an important role in how people confront an emergency. And the established research shows and describes processes of deciding under pressure and the cognitive phenomena in all, oops, wait a minute. I went one slide too far. Forgive me. Forgive me. I just wanted to say here about that. At the start of this COVID crisis, all I was seeing was this image on the left, the germ image. I mean, it's everywhere. And now it's become kind of synonymous with updates about the virus. But in the beginning, they were using that image on the left with risk communications that was coming out of some of the highest places and most trusted sources when they wanted us to wash our hands. So if you want people to wash their hands, use an image of someone washing their hands properly. If you want them to run away from a tsunami and go to higher ground, demonstrate it. And if you want them to take the stairs and not the elevator in the crisis in a fire, show the visual. So my apologies, I skipped over that now. Here we go. So we know that human psychology plays an important role in how people confront an emergency. And established research, describes that the cognitive processes of deciding under pressure and that cognitive phenomena that all humans exhibit when they're confronted with an emergency is kind of broken down into these three areas. And this is a little similar to what we did earlier, but I wanted to take this concept that was developed by Amanda Ripley from our book here, and Claudine Yaikin, I want to say her name is Yaikin. She was the illustrator of this diagram, and she's a professional kind of emergency communications illustrator. We're going to see her work with some maps in a moment. But the first thing that our brain does is we deny. No, we want to normalize that situation. No, it's not happening to us. We want to fit in that scenario into something we've already experienced in our life. And if we don't have the training or the experience with a public, with a program or the actions to take and to give us a non kind of disaster context, we won't think this makes sense to us. The denial phase can include tunnel vision. We only see limited cues or temporary cognitive paralysis and freezing. People freeze under pressure. We've seen this. We've seen this. You know, these heroic rescues of people, you know, too afraid to jump out of a burning building to take the risk. We see that with people, even with evacuations, they're too afraid to drive through the fire. Well, and how can you blame them? But they're going through this denial process. The next thing we do is we deliberate, and that's the milling phase we talk about. That's when we talk about going to talk to our friends, and we deliberate, and we want to confirm that there's really a danger there, and what actions we're supposed to take. And we want more information. We sometimes call this crowd psychology or collective behavior as well. And having knowledge and training in how to respond to a hazard allows the brain to cognitively respond to that disaster much faster and reduce the time we spent back in deliberation. You know, so if we know what to do, if we know from those tsunami warning signs that we have to go to higher ground, we're not looking around to see what others are doing. We're running to the higher ground. That's what this is all about. And the last one is deciding. So when individuals accept the reality of the situation and they decide to act or not, everyone goes through these three phases. But some people stay in denial for a prolonged period of time, and then they move quickly to deliberate and then to decide. And some people spend a lot of time deliberating, and then some people just say, right, I got this, you're telling me what to do, this seems important, I'm going to decide to go. So denial, deliberate, and decide. Those are the three things that happen all in our brains with these messages we're giving to people. So here's some maps for you, and this kind of combines all the science we have together in maps. Every emergency has maps, maps of the impacted areas, modeling maps, maps of evacuation routes. Emergency managers love their maps, and they have an important role to play for situational awareness and decision-making in the time of an emergency or crisis. But these maps were also used in public information briefings during fires in California, where we saw the worst fatality numbers in US history for a wildfire, and media were broadcasting and tweeting these maps to the public. But none of these maps is detailed enough to offer any true valid information. If you told someone you're in that shaded evacuated area, you know, if you're in the shaded area on the right, you need to evacuate, they would not be able to identify if they were in danger or not. Research shows that most people cannot identify where they live on a map, so sharing a topographical map like the one on the left is not helpful to them. But here's a helpful map. This map was created by a visual artist whose research supports risk communications. And her science-based graphics for the choice of font and color and look and feel are being adopted globally as the standard for evacuation maps. The arrows in this map on the right are telling you, I want you to move this way. And these maps are actually located on signposts throughout the tsunami warning areas of California. You can see the tsunami warning action at the top there, and then they're telling you below where to go to be safe. The researchers shared that people who were at the beach sensing danger would normally run to get their cars to get out of there, which were in the parkade. So if you look on where the circle is on this map in here, and you look right above it, there's a P. The parkade is right in the impact zone. So that is not a safe place for people to go if they see a tsunami. What they're telling them to do is to move north away 2 blocks and you will be safe. So they're showing them how the evacuation routes work, an alternative evacuation route, and they're clearly saying what the names of the streets are so people can identify with that. So the idea is to have people looking at them over time so when a crisis hits, they know what to do. They focus tested them with various audiences to see if they attracted attention, and most said yes. I see the warning sign, I see where you want me to go, and I would follow that because I feel now more in control that I know what I have to do. Their ability to deny, deliberate, and decide is reduced because the map is essentially telling them the action to take and in what direction to head. So number 3, when we talk about overcoming the barriers, is trust. using trusted and credible sources. And boy, Dr. Dina Hinshaw has really been that for us here in Alberta. And trust is really the foundation on which your entire program is being built. When you're communicating risk and the actions you want people to take, you need to earn that trust. If your audience doesn't trust you, they're not going to listen to your recommendations and take actions you want them to take. You need to be the first in communicating and be open and transparent with that information and be consistent. And if you don't know the answers or you're uncertain, you say so. Get back to people with those answers and admit mistakes or errors or oversights. Disclose risk information as soon as possible and don't minimize or exaggerate the level of risk. Keep it honest. Discuss data uncertainties, strengths and weaknesses, including anything that are identified by other credible resources and credible sources. Acknowledging uncertainty is most effective when the communicator both shows his or her distress and acknowledges the audience's distress. How I wish I could give you a definite answer on that, but we just don't have all of the information right now to give you that, to be decisive about that. It must be awful for people to hear how tentative we are and our reopening plans. But the reality is we are watching how the curve is going very, very closely to make sure we make the right decisions for public safety. You want to make sure that you are honest with people. Own your own narrative there. If you have a trusted and credible source that's out there, owning their own narrative is important in making sure they're providing good information. Follow the science in any health-based crisis. List trusted people on your website. I've seen that done for different municipalities. If you, as an example, there's a county in Ontario, I thought it was a great idea. They weren't just saying follow us in a crisis. They listed 6 or 7 other key influencers in the community, like the fire chief, the police chief, and others that they suggested people follow as well. And make your website the hub of your information. We want to be trusted and credible sources, but I'm seeing a lot of tweets that go out there that don't really link back to anywhere. You want people to be coming back to you, to your hub. You're owning that narrative, and you want to make your website the hub. So everything you put out there should link back to a place where people can get more information. And normally that's your website. Now, we've seen information and misinformation out there for absolutely, this has been an issue here, especially through social media platforms. And social media allows you to begin establishing conversations with your audiences today to plant yourself as a trusted and credible source for that crisis tomorrow. So if you're not on social media in your organization, you need to be. It's not a question of should I be, the question is you need to be. So, and another thing is to check out all your resources in your community. Your community Facebook pages are excellent way to keep a vibe on what's going on and a good place to correct misinformation. Identify your key influencers out there. Who are your organization leaders and your community leaders that you like to follow? Are you in an agricultural area? Is it a 4-H leader? Is it a local industrial association? Who are the influencers for you? Those people can help you get out accurate information. But if you find yourself in a space where you're correcting misinformation, remember, you have to monitor social media. You have to do that, and you have to do it with people. Algorithms and all that are great, but people don't answer questions. They don't always, people answer the questions. They start to see trends and themes forming about information you're probably going to need to be preparing and sharing down the road. You want to be correcting it immediately and getting credible quotes and updates out there, even with a photograph to kind of demonstrate your credibility in this. Making sure, using that to help get ahead of misinformation is really, truly important. And here's the thing, if you told me 6 months ago that I'd be using Doug Ford as an example of an empathetic leader, I would have laughed hysterically. But sometimes in a crisis, leaders and organizations can enhance their organization's reputation by the way they respond to their crisis. And Doug Ford is one of those people. Leaders need to be leaning in and leading their communities right now, or their provinces, or whatever, or their countries, whatever it may be. And you need to do it with empathy. You need to be active listeners. What are the publics telling you, and what do you need to get out there as far as information? You need to always be putting health and public safety first, and people over profit always. And I think what's interesting is Doug Ford, it said here that in February, according to a pollster, he only had 31% of support from Ontarians that approved of his job performance. And then here, just a few weeks ago, they did another poll and his approval rating soared to 74%. Like, that's crazy. But he has been out there answering the tough questions, leaning in with things that are all happening with the nursing homes in Ontario. He's been seen to be a good leader in this crisis out there. So make sure that your leaders are leading with empathy and that listening to what your audiences are saying and that they're putting health and people first always. And then, you know, we have this. They have this sort of element here with President Trump. And the idea is that you need to be monitoring your spokespersons and mentoring them when needed as well, so that we don't have misinformation coming from leaders when they misspeak or have a situation where they've misspoke about something and you have to actually go in and correct it. You know, people listen to presidents and prime ministers, lots of people. And after President Trump made these comments about injecting and ingesting these Lysol products to help with COVID-19, calls to the poison centers went up and health authorities and makers of these products had to go on the offensive to speak out against this misinformation and the fact that it could actually kill people. His comments did a disservice, I think, to everyone who was trying to get out the right information. And to be told, truth be told, I had to read this article several times before I understood that it was actually a true article and not fake news, because we had a lot of fake news, right? And this is a great infographic that talks about how to spot fake news. It's from the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. It's a Canadian resource and it's excellent. It tells you, you know, we've all been caught in that. You know, before you retweet or reshare something on your corporate or community pages, verify that the news is real. Because sharing that fake news impacts your credibility and can really deteriorate that trust and credibility that you've worked so hard to build up. So that's just something that's a good infographic for you to take away. And remember that not everything that's out, we know that not everything out there on the internet is true, but we also don't want to get caught sharing something that looks true. I mean, I'm sure that there were dolphins in the canal in Venice, but you know, you never know. And the fourth thing about this that we want to talk about, that fourth barrier and how we manage that barrier, is to release verified information ASAP. Go with what you know. The reality is that timely and accurate information does save lives, and you are never going to have all the information to release when you want to release it. You'll be lucky if you're actually the one breaking the news on an emergency or crisis, to be honest. In many cases, you're going to be responding to something you've seen or read on the internet or your social media pages. Gather, verify, coordinate, and disseminate your information as quickly as you can. Use holding statements, as I mentioned earlier, to buy yourself some time above when you're verifying and coordinating to get out. But get out first and try to get out fast. If you don't, your audiences will start telling your story for you, and it may not include all the facts or any of your key messages. So that is what's really, really important. Make sure you have a good crisis communications plan. Make sure you've got an approval process in there for how you're releasing that information, so you don't get something ready to release and it takes an hour and a half, 2 hours to get Joe, Bob, and Susie all to look at it, and everyone wants their piece of it to edit it out. Put a process in the plan and follow the plan. Use all of those tools that you have in that communications toolbox. You know, social media is a great tool, but it's not your only tool. Use traditional media. Use the stuff that you own, the media you own. Your own intranet pages for employees, your own Facebook pages, social media feeds, digital signs, community alerts. Sometimes we get so focused on getting our information out to the media, we completely forget about our own people and all of these other really, truly important audiences and tools we have. And remember, not everyone is on Twitter. Also, think about if you've got a board of directors. They're a great way to be disseminating your key messages out to a wider, broader audience. And they are seen probably as trusted and credible sources. So help use that. Give them a role in the crisis. So I wanted to talk a little bit here, and I'm just checking time to see how I'm doing. I'm getting pretty close here. I know I'm running a little bit over. with some tech difficulties there at the beginning. But I wanted to just take a moment to walk through some of the details about an event that happened and some case studies here, just so that we can kind of understand how we put this in play for situations where we've got, you know, to have to get timely information out. So this is an example of where, two examples I'm going to share really quickly here of where municipalities were responding to crises in their communities, and both had good learnings come out of the way they deconstructed it during their debriefs and walked away. But one of them released timely information and one of them did not. So this was an event that happened in Strathcona County here back in November 2018. And the RCMP responded to the community center in Sherwood Park at around 6:30 p.m. And there was reports of a fire. And the reality was that they were called to the scene and had another explosion later in the night. And they found a gentleman, a young man with a vehicle packed with explosives in the underground parkade with severe injuries. And he actually died in hospital. And the point of all of this is that this happened, that first explosion at 6:30 at night. Police and media were on the scene all night long in that cold winter night with nothing that came out to the media. No public information was shared until 11 o'clock the next morning. And the mayor went on to say, the media was camped out all night. The county had a message to release within the hour, but they said the RCMP were leading the investigation and didn't want them to release anything. The RCMP kind of pointed fingers back at the county. It was an active investigation, an active criminal investigation, and the police will always have the lead and own the scene. But the mayor owns the residents and the community in the sense of the demand and need to get public information out was paramount. And so how could they have supported? This was something that came out from Rod Frank. This is right from the news release. We didn't want to over communicate or miscommunicate. So instead we said nothing. And then people filled in their own information. And I think that this is a really interesting way that this was handled. And to the point where I did some work with K Division after the event, and we walked through the scenario and how we could make things better. And they actually had a public inquiry. So when we talked the very next day, I talked to some people about, so you couldn't share any information? Well, no, it was under investigation. This is what I think they could have shared. This explosion impacted people's lives, and the challenge was that they had to actually, the schools were closed. There was a home for the aging that was evacuated. The bus transfer station was closed. People couldn't use that route to work the next day. Employees didn't come into the office. They could have had to work from home. They have a public alerting system in Strathcona County that could have told all of their people what happened within 2 minutes using that alert system, but they chose to phone everyone at 2:30 in the morning. So not using the tools you own, not thinking about the impact to the public. You always have to think in that mindset. And so what happened after this is they did a public inquiry, and there were several key findings just under communications of what to do better. And I'm hoping that they're doing better. Number 2 there, a timely release of information to the public should be completed, notwithstanding life safety and stabilization requirements, period. You need to talk to the public. It's a demand. The public demands it, and clearly the inquiry is demanding it. So I'm hoping changes will be seen there. But that is just one of the things. And number 4, that barrier to that to getting people that information, making sure your information is timely. And quickly to run through this house explosion that happened in London, Ontario. I was so impressed with how they handled this that I actually reached out to them and asked if I could use this as a case study in my future trainings and my presentations. This was basically what did go well. So they had someone, a driver, a young girl, she was drunk driving and she hit a gas line in front of a house. And in the end, they had 7 homes that were impacted, and the girl charged with drunk driving. But within minutes of that home being impacted, the gas line, it exploded. People had very little time to get out of the area, and this was the damage this caused. And their lead communicator, Patty, is on the calls for their fire departments. And so she knew, listening to this, that this was going to be a big event, and started driving in before they needed her. But right away, they started posting on social media throughout the night. They had a call-in line for their organization. They did a media conference at 7:30 in the morning. They had ongoing and regular updates through social media. and that she still had, things that she shared. And one of them was, I think the biggest challenge is making sure the information in a changing situation is accurate. I had multiple conversations with our chief building inspector about the number of houses that were impacted and destroyed. And it wasn't until Friday afternoon that I realized what he was telling me had actually changed. He was double counting one house. We had the photos of it right in our operations center and nobody caught it. She said, I corrected it, but it bothered me that we had wrong information. And her other tip specifically for communicators is always keep a jacket or something, professional attire in your office in case you're called out in the middle of the night. She said, didn't realize that night what was gonna happen. I was wearing ripped jeans and a t-shirt and a ball cap that said bad hair day on it. And she says, and I was a little mortified that I had to introduce the mayor the next day in the morning wearing those clothes. So just some examples there. And to summarize all of this about the barriers and how we overcome them, use simple, consistent, specific messages for your audiences. Support them with clear visuals. Ensure they come from you, a trusted source, or if you're not the lead in the conversation, whoever the trusted source is, and release that accurate information and messages as soon as possible so people don't fill the gaps with their opinions. I'm at the end here, so I do apologize I went over there. I'd like to close this conversation and this presentation talking about your own teams and organizations. People are really emotional right now, and their routines have been altered, their vacations canceled, students are seeing their school years impacted, and people are still social distancing to a degree from family and friends. And we really don't know what phase 2 of COVID is going to look like, and that's a lot of worry and emotion and anxiety. So your own teams, comms teams are exhausted, and now people are looking at re-entry and reopening of facilities and organizations across the globe. This is going to require communications at every stage of the process. We're still in a pandemic and we're still communicating the risks associated with that. So I just ask you to please, remember that we think of ourselves as rational beings who are occasionally emotional, but moderate neuroscience tells us that we're really emotional beings who are occasionally rational. And communications needs to address these emotions and be mindful that every individual is impacted differently. But make no mistake, we are all impacted. Leading and communicating with compassion and empathy is more important than ever. And in times of uncertainty, it tends to bring out contradictions and misinformation. And it's important that our leaders really do use frequent, clear, and reliable information for their teams and in your employees as you start the reentry to avoid confusion and misinformation. Take the time to give your teams that opportunity to vent and address their own anxiety levels and balance that home work life thing that's going on, and lead by example here. If you want your team to take some downtime or mental health day, take one yourself. People don't go if the boss doesn't go. I want you to take time to pause, reflect, and refresh, and encourage others to bring new ideas to the table to support your solutions going forward with this crisis. There's many best practices out there. I'm just sharing some of what we've discussed briefly in this presentation. I'll share a list of resources at the end here, and I invite you to download, review, and share them with others. Don't reinvent the wheel with your risk communications planning and programs. Adopt the best practices and reuse and rebrand the work with permission of others as needed. Check out Pinterest, check out infographics. A key element for any success of, in crisis is, of course, communications. It's critical, but in the spirit of public health and safety and the promotion of risk communications, let's commit to doing more by working together to collaborate, cooperate, coordinate, and communicate with one another. Risk communications can save lives, and there is nothing more important than knowing that what we do and how we do it can make a difference. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Shawna.
I am sorry I went over there. I kept cutting it down, but
awesome.
I started talking about this, and then I think about other things I didn't put in my notes. And
you've provided so much valuable information and insight, and I love the examples. I think the biggest takeaway for me anyways was really in relation to the specific and visual messaging. Even here when we're flipping back and forth from, is it 2 meters or 6 feet between between each other, depending on what system you use. And one of the cool things in Canada that I've seen is the hockey stick.
Yeah.
So that's the appropriate distance. Another really cool one that I saw too was a video where they sang happy birthday twice and had some fun with it. So I really appreciated that for sure. So for everybody watching, we can have a couple minutes for questions if you want. Otherwise, what we can do is if you want to submit them, and then we can answer them, because we'll be sending all the resources via email after. Probably on Monday, because we just want to be able to edit the video a little bit before we send it out. And we are going to do another poll. So we'll put that poll up. And this will be for for that book that you were talking about, Shawna.
Oh, great.
We'll give that book away to someone. So